I did bungee jumping a few years ago. And so basically they ask you to jump off. And so it feels like you're just walking off the ledge without any support. And that's the vision I have when I envision like leaving our strong careers to like build a new company.
Hate festers. Like it will fester. And you never want to leave a startup hating your co-founders.
This is like I would say a mini therapy session as well. Feel that way.
That is true.
Welcome to How I Met My Co-Founder, the podcast where entrepreneurs share raw stories behind how their founding teams met, built trust, and navigated conflict. I'm your host and team relationship expert, Annie Garofalo, and here's your all-access pass into the conversations that can make or break a founding team. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first live podcast recording. I had the chance to meet Andrew and Sarmad, co-founders of LastMile AI, live in New York City. The two worked together at Meta starting in 2020 and quickly realized they wanted to start a company together. The exact idea didn't matter so much as long as they did it together. They landed on creating an AI developer platform for engineering teams and have since closed a $10 million seed round and have built an amazing team and product. Some burning questions I had for the team were, how did you know you'd work well together? How do your respective marriages influence your partnership? And what have been the biggest adjustments moving from a corporate job at one of the largest tech companies to starting a new company from scratch? But let's kick off with something simple. How did you meet your co-founder?
Sarmad and I worked on the same team at Facebook AI. I remember I joined 2020.
I think this was COVID. So
2020.
Yeah,
Andrew
the
was-
tail end of 2019. And the first team that I worked with was with Sarmad's team on like how to develop and start authoring the tooling around machine learning. Worked together on a few projects then, and then I switched to another product called ML Hub, and at that time Sarmad wasn't on the team.
Yeah.
And I distinctly remember with that team, I was like, I wish Sarmad was working with me on this. And I remember I was like, hey Sarmad, like I know your plate is full, but do you want to work on this with me?
Even though it was all remote, like we hadn't met, by the way, for like a year or a year and a half into the like our working together, but just immediately there's this like aligned frequency of how we think and how we are just focused on solving a problem. And the team that Andrew moved to had several large problems that we needed to solve. And so that was like our project to work on together. And it was like a huge success. And I was a new manager at the time as well. I was still trying to like figure out what it's like to be a people manager. And so it was also like really nice for Andrew to have trust in me to be like, hey, I want to work on this like big problem with you. And we pulled it off. We like built a good product. We built a really good team. We hired the right people. And so that kind of gave us a little bit of confidence that we could kind of do this. And our managers at the time were also, because Andrew was kind of new to Facebook, he came from Airbnb. I was a new manager. This was almost like our test and into like, can we do things independently? And I think that cemented our relationship as well.
I think the key thing I really liked was it wasn't just a technical problem. Like it required fixing a lot of things. And I think in my mind, it was like the working relationship I had with Sarmad and how he fixed things didn't have boundaries, if that makes sense. Because oftentimes like you find someone to work with and you're like, what is that exact problem to solve? And it might be that the problem to solve is something that is non-technical. It might be around how do you get people to work better together? How do they collaborate together? Maybe you were working on the wrong thing or like the product or the technical side. All of it is part of it, right?
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's so interesting that the two of you met and you started working at Meta, which is a massive corporation. And like you said, the problem you were solving happened to be very holistic and require a lot of thought, not only about the problem, but also about building the right team, thinking about like the relational side of things, probably strategic impact. There's so many things going on that sound parallel the startup journey in a lot of ways where maybe a typical corporate job might not. I'm curious if there's the flip side. Like, were there things that you experienced at Meta that have been very different in your startup journey together?
Oh yeah, I mean, nothing quite prepares you for a startup, to be quite honest. I think it is a rite of passage and an initiation of its own. The biggest difference is just how unstructured everything is in a startup environment. There is nothing, and you're building something out of nothing. And you're building a team, you're building the processes that the team operates with, you're building a product and you're getting customers, you're building a brand. There's literally nothing, and you're trying to stand things up and figuring out what's the right order to do that. Even simple things like, how do you interview people? You could technically do whatever you want. And so we lean back on the process that we knew, but a large company is very structured. It's made so many mistakes over time that they've kind of figured out what works. And also the time that we were there, it's already scaled beyond what like the early days were like, which is a very different part of a company's history than when it's already successful. And so unlearning some things from what you know of, like the things that you're slotted into in a big organization, and trying to figure out what do you need to survive. That's the first step of building any business. It also is a different kind of, there's more camaraderie, I would say, because it's very mission oriented to build something. Every day things go wrong and you celebrate the wins, and it feels just a lot more emotionally, tied to your identity in a way that I never felt in any other company or any other place that I've at least worked at.
That's a big one, yeah. I think because startups take so much of your time and focus that, like what you mentioned, that your identity and your startup start merging together, it's very bizarre.
Yeah.
Yes. I think particularly in a startup, there's this combination of, it's not just functional skill sets that you're bringing to work, it's also your like social side, whether it's friendships or leadership skills. There's so many social aspects that are all encompassing, plus emotional aspects. As you think about how the two of you support each other as co-founders, how do you think about what those expectations are that you had for each other coming into this, knowing or learning how socially, emotionally taxing this choice was to start a company?
I feel like from my side, maybe it's like too much confidence or something, but maybe it was just like, I think we could just solve everything. I was like, it didn't feel like, there are challenges that are way harder than I think I originally intended or what I originally expected. But for the most part, there wasn't really new expectations. It was like, oh, we can do this. Like, I'm confident that the way that we work together, the way I trust Sarmad and hopefully trust me, like we can fix any issue and adapt to do it. I think when we have like our best intentions and look out for each other, like that works really well, because we don't expect perfect. I hope you don't expect perfection.
No,
because I think it's not fair to put it that.
Yeah.
I think early on I talked to Sarmad, like every feedback I got from founders, they're like, it's like you're getting married. Both of us are married, and so part of that was like, okay, then like when you're married, you think of how do we solve a problem. It's not like Sarmad, let me down. It's like, no, we need to fix this, or like we need to solve this. It's not like pointing fingers. It's like we're on the same team and we're gonna have to fix this. Yeah.
And I think, Annie, I mentioned this the first time we met, that I had like, I knew I wanted to build a company with Andrew before I knew what I wanted to build. And I think for anyone building a company, it's really figure out the co-founders first, in my opinion, because that, like Andrew said, it's a marriage. It's like, that's the person who you're going to go up and down with. And there are many like roller coaster rides along the way. And Andrew is like one of the most confident people I know. He's one of the most competent people I know. And I have complete trust, and I think he has trust in me that we'll just like work through things. And it's not a straight line ever, but it's the person like who do you trust, who you can talk to, figure out anything, and who you feel psychologically safe with, where you don't feel like, we give each other feedback all the time, but I always know it's coming from a great place where it's about helping me be the best version of me. And same for like when I give Andrew feedback. And I think that's really healthy, and you need to be able to do that. It's not finding someone you don't disagree with, but it's finding someone who makes you the best version of yourself that you can be. And then like everything else builds on from there.
It sounds like your relationship is grounded in a lot of the core tenets that are also very important for marriages, which you're both married, and so you're probably no stranger to this, but there's this framework called the Sound Relationship House that has the core tenets of a healthy relationship. The two weight-bearing walls are trust and commitment. So commitment, you can think accountability, you can think psychological safety, but knowing that that person's going to be in it for the long haul. And then that first foundational floor is called love mapping, which I've renamed to be business mapping. And that is to understand how you as a worker or an employee or a co-founder know how you like to get from A to B, your conflict style, your communication style, and how the rest of your teammates like that. And you kind of have that understanding of yourself and others. As you think back to that transition from your corporate jobs at Meta into kind of making the decision to do the startup, walk us through that process and what that looked like.
It feels like, I did bungee jumping a few years ago, and it's I don't know if you've done it, but it's a very weird experience because
weird
on a ledge.
You mean scary or
Well, it's so weird you're jumping off this cliff.
weird? Yes, no big
So
deal. It's weird.
So you feel this like there are these things that are attached to your legs, right? To kind of hopefully they're done well, so you don't just fall to your deaths, but you don't feel it. And so basically they ask you to jump off, and so it feels like you're just walking off the ledge without any support. And that's the vision I have when I envision like leaving our strong careers to like build a new company. It's very scary, and it does require, no matter how confident you are, I think it does require that support and that trust in each other, because we are each other's like support systems in that. And so probably like the starting out phase of just figuring out what's the company, what's the right idea to go after, what's the right team to build, making sure those boxes were ticked early on. I think we helped each other through that. And then the second part of that was just being there for each other emotionally as well. I remember one of the conversations we had before we started, Andrew asked me like, what motivates you in life, Sarmad? Like, why do you even, he was really, I think that was the first time we talked about that, like, what is it that drives you? And I learned a lot about Andrew through that process as well, just to make sure our priorities in life were aligned. Because it's a huge undertaking, it's like an all-consuming thing that you're signing up for. And I do feel this sense of responsibility, both for the team, for you, even for the people in my life who, it comes at the cost of something, and you just have to be conscious of that, where like if you're working late, you're spending less time with your wife or your family, or, if you have relatives, you may not spend time with family that much. And so just making sure that you're giving it your all, but you realize that everybody's sacrificing something to make this possible. That requires a great deal of respect and just self-awareness, I think.
Yeah.
I think it's funny because the weird analogy you made was the bungee jump.
Yeah.
I think from my standpoint, it felt like we're climbing down this hill, and you're like, let's just take a few more steps down. And then take a few more steps, and then before I'm like, wait a second, where the heck are we? It didn't feel like a massive leap. It felt like, it felt like a number, like however many coffee shops, how many coffees you drank and walks, and then eventually I was like, where has Sarmad taken me?
That's so interesting. Yeah. What do you think is indicative of the difference in those analogies?
I think it might be two different things, where I think I might be more risk adverse.
Mm-hmm.
And so with that, for me, it kind of has to be like small jumps, like 10 small bungee jumps. And then I'm like, wow, that's like pretty far. And I think Sarmad is like, oh, there's a big leap or there's a big jump, and I want to take this big jump type of thing. And so it's, but it's all the same because we both are here.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Just two different styles. Yeah.
Would you say that Andrew is risk averse, and or is that a surprising thing to hear for you?
No, I think he's right. Actually, you learn these things over time. I also learned I'm a little bit perhaps more reckless than I thought I was. But I think that is actually a very good counterbalancing force because, and this comes up even in the product decisions we make sometimes, or just generally like how we talk to investors, or literally everything about a startup is about balancing risk and reward. And I do think it's helped for me to partner with Andrew on that because we do see things in slightly different ways. I can be a lot more aggressive at times, and that may not be the best thing. And so just like Andrew's like, hold up, like let's take a step back, let's think through this. That does help. And probably similarly, I think the inverse is true too, where I feel like I jumped off a cliff because I'd already made up my mind that I wanted to do this much sooner. But walking through those steps with Andrew, where it felt like we were going for a walk and
both physically
and
metaphorically and for sure physically,
for sure,
at least 50,000 plus steps.
We talked a lot. We talked about the idea. We talked about what are the opportunities here and how do we give ourselves a fair shot. And so I think that's the difference that you see in perspective.
I'm so happy you brought this up. I have this exercise that is my favorite exercise to do with teams. And it's called How Well Do I Know My Co-Founder? It goes across each person, kind of 7 working style dimensions. And the last one that I like founders to put themselves on and guess where their co-founder is how comfortable with risk or uncomfortable with risk someone is. And sometimes people are completely aligned, sometimes they're very different. But I find that a successful team is one where the co-founders know where the other one falls. There's no difference in perception. And so that's why I asked you the question of, was that surprising? And you said no. And yes, you can get to the same spot with those different styles, but it takes, the journey looks different. And that's okay, and you need to know that, and you need to walk alongside each other in that, and be patient and tolerant when there are those differences.
And tying it back to marriage, I think that's like, you need to know what your partner's triggers are. You need to know what motivates them and how they think about things, because different people are just going to think about things differently. And so I think that added level of awareness of how Andrew thinks, and it does help. I understand where Andrew's coming from now, probably a lot better than, and that just builds over time. You learn about that, but you have to respect that too.
And then tying that back to a specific point, when you're hosting me and Marie for dinner and you're making focaccia bread, and then you're like, I'm just gonna add this ingredient, and I was like, oh, okay, did you do that before? He's like, nope. I was like, are you gonna taste it? He's like, nope. And I was like, okay, interesting. This is the time where you experiment and love it.
You were like noted, and when that comes in the workplace.
That was the first time I'd had them over too.
I
mean, it was phenomenal. The dinner was absolutely incredible.
It works.
Seeing his style, where I was like, you're not gonna taste it at all? That really blew my mind. He's like, sometimes you gotta feel it, and you put in a special ingredient, and I was like, okay. Mentally noted for as they're doing this company.
And so
does that ever come up in your meetings when you're kind of approaching a decision? You're like, oh, this is a focaccia moment.
This is a focaccia moment. Let's go with it. It's gonna work.
It'll be
it'll be magical.
I do really like bringing levity into those heavier conversations, especially when there's a difference in how you approach things. Just being like, focaccia, and it just brings a lightness to it, and also an explanation to this is, I think, what we're struggling with. Let's take a minute and just address our differences and how we.
But the team is large now, so if we say that, people would just be like, "What's going on?" Okay, lunch is over. Let's get back to the decision.
I love that. I love that so much. Let's see. One question I get a lot is, how indicative is someone's marriage of who they will be as a co-founder? And I'm curious if that played into your decision at all to co-found with each other, and how much you knew about each other's marriages, how much you relied on that as an indicator.
Wow.
Whoa. So the other person's marriage is in Sarmad's marriage?
Yes.
I don't think that informed much, just because we worked together through a lot of things through Facebook already. The primary factor was we've worked together for years before. The funny thing is when you said the pillars or the walls and one being accountability, it's funny because I never really thought about that, but that is a fairly important thing, which was for that time, it was probably a factor whether I unconsciously thought or not, but who can I really trust and who do I really believe in is accountable, who can help me out here.
Yeah.
And I think continuously that still is the case, which is every time we work on something, I know for the fact that when things get hard or whether we need to scramble for something or whether pressure's on, that Sarmad's there and he's accountable and he is there with my back and we're able to solve these things. And that's, I never really thought about it explicitly, but that's definitely one thing that is nice to have, which is knowing that no matter, because startups like guaranteed times will be tough.
Yes.
And we're in a seed stage company, and so it'll be tough going forward. We're just at the beginning and it's already tough and there's more toughness to come. But it's really assuring that I think Sarmad's there and the accountability piece. And so I guess long story short, not so much of Sarmad's marriage, but mostly around I guess the accountability that I've seen before and how that plays a role. Yeah.
I would say the same for me, because I think it's probably different where we built our relationship independently of, like, we weren't socially friends to start off with. We were coworkers, so we always had like that foundation. But it was probably a lot deeper, I would say, than probably traditional, like, regular coworkers would. And I always felt this affinity to be able to trust Andrew with really like any problem. And I remember the first time we met was Madison Square Park, and we went to Italy in New York City. And then walked around the park. Hours.
Hours and hours, yeah.
And we were just talking about, like, okay, we were just talking about the problems we faced, and we had to make some bold decisions. And by the end of that walk, we had like aligned on what we had to do, and we were like, yeah, let's go for it. And it ended up like really changing the course of that team and that project. But that cemented our relationship. And I think Andrew alluded to this earlier, that startups require you to go even deeper. And so our relationship has definitely deepened since then, because ultimately, like, when you're coworkers in a big company, there's still limits to how you interact with each other. But I think it is indicative in some way of like who you choose to spend your life with, as like what that person is like. It is reflective of who you are in some ways. But I knew Andrew already. It just like confirmed what I already knew. It wasn't like a revelation again. And just to like actually one thing that's reminded me of, Andrew is extremely empathetic as well, which is not something I knew up front, like when we were just coworkers, but I think I've learned that more about him over time. For example, like you said, startups are stressful. I remember one time we were walking and Andrew
anyways, just 75% of the time.
And Andrew asked me, like, how is Amina, my wife, doing through all this? And I thought that was a very like poignant question, because you can ask like how you're doing, but to ask how someone else is doing, like that requires you to understand like the toll of building a company extends beyond just yourself as a founder. I think like in a big tech setting, you don't often see the complete person for who they are. There's always that little filter that you like go through, because it's like a 9 to 5 or 10 to 6 or whatever kind of job it is. And so seeing a person completely and them confirming and even deepening like your respect that you have for them, I think that comes out. And hopefully that's like what founders feel when they like get to really know someone more. And that's what true in a marriage too, like you want to discover more about your partner that makes you feel lucky to be with them. That's how I feel with Andrew. Hopefully that's how you feel with me. But like that, I think that respect has deepened since we worked together at the start.
I think it's going back to love math.
I really like that, and I think that what I'm hearing is it's not a decision factor, but it can be indicative of, I appreciate how that person interacts with other important people in their life, and they show up the same across different spheres of life, which is really hard to find in a lot of people. And I'm also hearing that it was important to have strong support systems outside of the startup. Because as you mentioned, the startup is all consuming and not only affects you, but also the people around you. And so making sure that those relationships are strong before diving into something this challenging, this uncertain, full of rejection, it's really important to have those social support systems
Absolutely.
built around them.
I think you need to be just an emotionally stable person, because there's so much that this throws at you, this experience, and being able to just be very rational and analytical and not lash out when things go wrong, but also not be so euphoric that like you lose sight of the bigger picture when things go well. I think all of that requires a degree of emotional stability and maturity that like you have to come into this with or learn it very quickly,
Yeah, I think the startup's only possible with obviously us as co-founders, but co-founder at home, my wife, who also without that, I don't even know how it's possible. Like that has to be there. Yeah. Which is interesting. Yeah. I think only because the startup is so encompassing that the lines are really blurred.
Yeah, it's very unique to this particular space.
Yeah.
And also this stage,
Yeah.
I think. And so I'm curious, and I know this is probably a hard question, but what's a tough conversation that the two of you have had?
I think the one that resonates most is like strategic pivots. Where especially the AI space, you're constantly experimenting, you're constantly testing things out. And so that's where it's going to be like a differing opinions, but we have a really healthy way of resolving it, which is it's never we come in and we're just like, we need to have a really hard, big pivot. It's mostly like, when you're driving and you're making small adjustments, staying in lane and all these type of things. It's never a hard U-turn. It's like we make these small adjustments and eventually we find ourselves having made large shifts, but the small ones are all digestible. Okay. We're getting back to the marriage thing, but it's similar to like a marriage where you never want to hold something in until it becomes a problem. And then it becomes a much bigger problem. Because then you unleash everything and you're like, let me take out my laundry list. Back in 2021. Yeah. And so it never becomes a laundry list of things where you're like, back when we started the company, you did this, and then remember 2 weeks later you did this, and then the day after, it just becomes a constant shift because in the end we need to be constantly aligned and we need to make constant decisions, which means if there's ever, and I think Sarmad even wrote this up very at the beginning, which was we'll never have like pent up anger or resentment. Like bring it up early. We never want any, because hate festers. Like if you let it 12-week, month, 2 months, it will fester. And you never want to leave a startup hating your co-founders.
No, it's the worst case scenario. And Julie and John Gottman, who are founders of the Gottman Institute, a leading couples therapy institute, their biggest, they wrote a book on how to predict divorce. And the biggest predictor was contempt. And I think that is so telling and very true in any relationship. That if you allow that contempt to build up and that resentment for the other person, that your relationship at that point is very hard to come back from that. And so bringing up what I like to call these little pinches, which are maybe it's just a little thing that increases your heart rate and or just bothers you a little bit, and having the language and the space to say, oh, by the way, that didn't land super well with me. Like, we don't need to address it. I just wanted to let you know right now, and I'll let you know if it happens again. But before it becomes something major. And like what you said, addressing that in little increments over time, and then that helps you to shift, but not in a way that feels like you need a reset.
I think even on the other things, title and equity and all those things are really important. And I know early on when we were just figuring out, like not just for the two of us, but just generally for the team, Andrew wrote up this like just list of, there's like things that I do really well and traits that I have and things that Andrew does really well. And there's actually a really nice exercise that showed us how complementary we are. And like we fill each other's gaps really, really well, in my opinion. And it was like just seeing that written down, that was amazing to just visually see that come together. And so I think we do a lot of things like that in an analytical way that just doesn't even create the room for conflict. And I don't think we've ever had a conversation where we yelled at each other or were rude to each other, like literally never. And I think part of that is probably just like temperamentally we're really similar in how we approach problem solving. And second, I think it's just about, assuming best intent. I always know Andrew is coming from a good place and he wants the company to succeed. He's looking out for me. And so when I have that as my like baseline, then no matter what he says, I interpret it in the most positive way possible. And so that also creates room for him giving tough feedback as well. And we often have that where like he's like, Sarmad, you could have like said that slightly better, or don't mention this next time, or X, Y, Z. And I always take it in the right way.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably just a really core tenet of our relationship. And then the last thing is we just have this rule that we're not gonna like hold in anything for more than a few days. Sometimes you do need to like process things, so it's okay to take a few days to like figure stuff out, especially when it comes to like product decisions, for example. But like Andrew said, nothing should ever fester. And if you're bringing up something from like months ago, then we failed that rule.
Yeah. That's true. It's like a statute of limitations.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that rule. Also, I love the thoughtful exercise of kind of mapping out your founder profiles.
The funny thing is, I think we did some of it in Stavros Library, which is kind of funny when, like, in the public library where I think it's very quiet and we're just whispering. Like, what's the title gonna be? What's the equity split? It's like,
what do we appreciate about each other?
Why are we doing this in the public library?
I love that. Good use of public spaces.
Yeah.
It's
It's
a good
great
plug for the New York Public Library.
Yes,
I love that. Unfortunately, we're coming to an end of our time. It's been such a delight speaking with the two of you. I always like to close out these conversations asking what your advice for an early stage startup team is. What's a piece of advice that you would give that you wish you'd heard but hadn't, because this is not readily accessible information?
One thing is, this is something I've learned actually through the process. You're just so passionate about an idea when you get started, right? Like it always starts with some problem that hopefully a founder has, or something they're just really passionate about solving. But don't be so tied to the idea. I think that's really important, because ideas will change, but the people you want to build these companies with, they should ideally be the same people for the lifetime of that company. And also at the earliest stage, the faster you try out different things, the more shots on goal you take, the better your chances, just like probabilistically speaking, there will be of getting something that works. And so I think a lot of times, at least what I've seen, is some founders are very tied to their idea, and that can be at the root of like conflict as well, where because they're so tied to this thing that they thought of, they're so passionate about it. If someone tells them something they don't want to hear, and if it's their co-founder doing that, then it can become a source of tension. And in the worst case, that can like fester and cause problems. So really just like assume that, everything is on the table for revisiting, and have that trust with your co-founder that they're coming from a good place, and hopefully they are. Validate that as, a founding team. But then like really solve the problem, which is ultimately make the company successful. Nothing else really matters than like having especially if you're starting out a company at the earliest stages.
Nice. Let's see what I can add on to that. I think have tough conversations to make sure that you have a framework or a process to always have difficult conversations. Looping it back to marriage, where like the conversations that should come up are like how you want to deal with finances, religious beliefs, political beliefs. These are all really tough things, especially when you start dating and you have to go through these steps. Forming a company, you'll go through equal things, which is like, how do you foresee the company going? How do you see in terms of where we should be, how we do this, or work-life balance and all these type of things. And if you don't have a methodology for how to bring this up organically and being able to discuss in a healthy way, it will lead to problems down the road. It's not like it's magically disappeared. Like, we don't need to do this anymore. It's always there. It's just hidden under. And so having really difficult conversations up front and being able to really feel comfortable that you can have these conversations is a really good indicator that you found individual co-founders who can really solve problems long term and figure out a path. as opposed to you're hiding problems here and there, and eventually they'll come up and cause havoc.
Yes. And it's in that I'm hearing there's might be some short-term discomfort, some immediate discomfort, but that's so much better than immediate comfort with that long-term kind of implication of having all these hidden problems pop up everywhere in the long term.
And it's a lot worse discussing it when it hurts.
I think that's really beautiful. And then also, Sarmad, to your point of the company will always change, and also your relationship and your personal priorities will also be shifting. And so having a space and container to revisit those, whether it's revisit how you like to communicate, revisit your priorities, and having a container for that too is something that I'm hearing. Yeah. Those are great pieces of advice. Thank you so much again for joining us. It was an absolute delight, and I look forward to seeing where your relationship goes, where LastMile AI goes.
Thank you for having us. This was amazing.
Of course.
This is like I would say a mini therapy session as well. Feel
that is true. Very, I love it.
I'm glad. No, it sounds like you're already having these types of conversations, but I'm happy to help deepen it however I can.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Annie.
LastMile AI, we're a company that's looking to productionize LLM applications, and we provide the tooling and the platform to help you. And so if you're looking for some help on getting LLMs into production, contact us.
Thanks for listening to the show this week. Please make sure to click the follow button on your podcast app so you never miss an episode of the show. Do you have a burning question? We'll be concluding this season with an Ask Annie Anything. Submit questions at confidant, confidante.info/podcast or email podcast@confidant.info. I'm Annie Garofalo, and thank you for listening to How I Met My Co-Founder.